The Lord be with you. Okay, we'll try one more time. We need to do it loud enough that the people that are still getting their coffee in the atrium can find their way in here. Ready? The Lord be with you. Good job. Wonderful. Welcome to you all who are here for the first time, weren't with us yesterday, and those who have returned, and especially all those who are joining us online. It is good to be together again for this second in our lecture series as we remember and honor the legacy of David and Ruth Watermulder. We've already heard all of Lisa's credentials and all of the ways that she is connected with communities of repair and reconciliation here in the United States and around the world. So I won't waste the time that you came to hear from her reading that again, but I did want to read for you just this week. The Christian Century reviewed Lisa's new book, Fortune. And if you all don't get this email, you should get it. The Christian Century will send you an email every week of books that you should be reading. And so when I opened my email this Thursday, it said Lisa Sharon Harper. And so I timed it perfectly for that and for Lisa to be with us this weekend. I wanted to read to you from the book editor Jessica Messman's review of Fortune. She writes, "When I finished Fortune, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that I had been generously invited into the sacred space of an entire family's collective memory. But I was also hungry for justice. When Harper turns in the last third of her book from the mending of personal fractures to the steps we might take to repair the ongoing damage of white supremacy and racism in America, her call to the beloved community lands with even greater urgency because of the family story she has told." Friends, we are privileged today to have Lisa with us to tell us that family story again and to help us think about what it means to act with justice and repair in the world as a congregation. If you don't have a copy of Fortune yet, we have copies out in the atrium that you can pick up for $10 after the lecture, and so I encourage you to do that. If you didn't bring any money with you today, we will trust you. We want to get that book in your hands, and so you can get that donation to us later. But let us open with prayer. We come to you in faith, O God, trusting that you will speak your word and bring the healing we need. Hear our prayers. Bring healing to the nations. Let this land be a sanctuary, a safe place for strangers, immigrants, and refugees, so that all people may experience your saving love. Bring healing to your church. Keep us faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ and set us free from the evils of this age, so that we may seek your realm of justice and peace. Speak your word to us today, O God. Let it be a message of good news throughout the earth, the nation, and the church, and in the hearts of your beloved people, so that the promises of faith may be fulfilled through Jesus Christ, the word of life. Amen. Let us welcome Lisa Sharon Harper.
Thank you so much for your incredible hospitality since I've been here. It's been such a joy to get to know the pastors. Rebecca, thank you so much for your awesome welcome. And yesterday, I think it was a 10-minute introduction. It was kind of like, okay, got to live up to this now. Well, I want to say also thank you for this morning, for a lovely service and for leaning in and listening and for coming back. My mother used to sing over me as a child. When I would go to sleep at night, she would sing the songs that our ancestors sang on plantations in South Carolina and Kentucky. And she would sing, "Wade in the water Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Now that song was a song sung by enslaved communities when they knew somebody was going to run, because they had to run and find the river and wade into the river, wade into the water in order to get free. And that was troubled water. There were water moccasins in those waters. There was dangerous animals in those waters. If you were in Florida, there would be alligators in the waters. Hello, somebody, right? But they still had to wade into the water because the dogs couldn't smell them in the water. So if they wanted to get free, they had to wade in. There is a group called Sweet Honey in the Rock. Anybody here familiar with Sweet Honey in the Rock? Hello, somebody. I love Sweet Honey in the Rock. I saw when I was a little kid. My mom used to take us to see them sing in Philadelphia, like big venues. And I'll never forget watching them. And they sang Wade in the Water. And I was watching a concert once where they explained, they said this. They said, in order for enslaved people to get north, they have to get through the water. They have to go through the water. They have to go through troubled waters. We as a nation have to go through troubled waters in order to get free. In order for us to actually fully live in to that vision of the beloved community that Dr. King laid out for us, and that is really only a vision of the kingdom of God, the rule of God. Shalom. The last book that I wrote was called The Very Good Gospel, and that book was an exploration of shalom. It took 18 years of my life to research and live out and write on and speak on and go to different lands and see how does it apply here and how does it apply here. And finally, I wrote the book. And the next natural step then was to ask the question of how does the breaking of shalom, how does it play out in my family? How have the decisions that our nation has made about the hierarchies, that created hierarchies of human belonging, how has that impacted my family? So I've been researching actually for 30 years. In the first 20 or 25 or so, I was not thinking about a book. I was just researching to know who I am as an African American. But this book compiles all of that research, 30 years of research, 10 generations, one family. It's a call to truth-telling. It's a call to reparation. And it's a call to forgiveness for those things that can never be repaired. I want to tell you the story of Fortune Game McGee. Fortune Game McGee, for many of you who were here yesterday, you'll be familiar with this story. But I want to tell you a little bit more. She lived in Virginia. She lived in Maryland. She was born around 1687, actually in 1687. She was hauled into court in 1705. And the reason she was hauled into court is because of the very first race laws that were established on American soil. You see, those very first race laws first began in Virginia. And in order for us to understand her plight in 1705, we have to kind of retread some ground that we covered yesterday, and then I'll bring us up to speed. How many of you were here yesterday? Or watching yesterday? Oh, good, a good number of you. How many of you were not? How many of you were not here? Okay, so this is for you, for those who were not here, and also for those who are watching online, who weren't here. So, 1662, go back. In the colony of Virginia, there's a law that is passed. It is the very first race law that's passed on this soil. It's passed in response to a phenomenon that is happening. Enslaved people, mixed race enslaved people, are taking their cases to court and winning and walking off the plantations. And this began with a young girl named Elizabeth Key, who was born around 1630. Only about, 22 years or after the establishment of Virginia, the colony of Virginia, the very first colony. She was raised just downriver or right across the river from Jamestown by her father, Thomas Key, who was a member of the House of Burgesses. He had her baptized, and he recognized her as his daughter. Well, you see, English common law said that you could not enslave another English citizen, nor could you enslave another Christian. This was the law. So she realized, wait a minute, I've been baptized, I'm a Christian, and my father is a British citizen. And here's another thing, British citizenship came through the line of the father. So she took her case to court and she won. She said, I shouldn't be able to be enslaved. I am a British citizen because my father is a British citizen. And by the way, he had me baptized and recognized it to everybody. So she won. And after her, a flood of other people began to say, wait a minute, my father is a British citizen and I'm being enslaved. And oh, by the way, I'm also baptized, And so they won their cases. Now, the House of Burgesses they were the planter class. So they are the ones now losing their free labor. So what do these lawmakers do? The ones who actually are responsible for crafting the law. And the law is supposed to be that kind of secular Bible of a society. It's supposed to tell us in a society what is true and just and right? It's the way we have decided we want to live together. So what do? They changed the law. They changed where citizenship came from. They said, no longer are we, an English colony, going to abide by English common law. We are now going to abide by Roman law. Now, somebody please tell me what Roman law has to do with Virginia, okay? I'm not quite sure. But they switched it to Roman law because Roman law exercised the rule of partus, which it brought citizenship through the line of the mother. Hello. You see, the issue on the ground in Virginia was the serial rapes of enslaved African women by their British citizen masters, creating an upswell of mixed-race children that were confusing the caste system. So rather than doing what they could have done, rather than, slowly moving into a system of just paid labor, okay, we have confusion. We're going to just move into an actual capitalist society where you pay people what their work is worth. Rather than doing that, they shift the law in order to maintain their bottom line. 2 years later, in 1664, Fortune Game McGee, the law that entrapped her decades later, was born. And that law, because all law is created in response to a perceived problem on the ground, is different. It's different than in Virginia. Their perceived problem on the ground was not white men raping and enslaved African women, though that was happening. But that was not perceived as a problem there. The perceived problem there was white women marrying and having children with enslaved black men. There were 600 mixed-race children that were born during the colonial era alone, just in Maryland and Delaware. All of them traced back to white women. So, what did they do? How did they respond to this phenomenon? The planter class, who was also the legislators in the General Assembly of the colony of Maryland, this is what they did. They declared that if any white woman married an enslaved black man and had children by that man, she too would become enslaved by her husband's master, and her children would be enslaved in perpetuity. Now, they eventually begged off of the whole, we're going to enslave white women thing. But not before this, not before. They looked up a few years later and they realized that planters were actually forcing their indentured white women, mostly Ulster Scot and Irish women, who were, working right alongside enslaved men, enslaved black men, African men, and falling in love with them and having children. They began to force them to marry the enslaved black men and have children by them. Why? Because it increased their bottom line. So this Catholic colony, clutched its pearls and said, "Ooh, we didn't mean to do that." And so what did they do? They decided to place the power to decide who gets enslaved and who gets indentured, and the management of indenture, into the hands of the church rather than in the hands of the planters. So, throughout the rest of the colonial era, the church becomes the primary auctioning block in the colonies. The church becomes the primary manager of the crushing of the image of God on earth, on this earth. So, by the time Fortune stands before this court in 1705, and they are trying to decide if she's going to be enslaved or indentured or free, there's no longer white women being enslaved. They've begged off of that. But what they've landed on, in around 1692, they landed on a law that said, if you trace back to a white woman, you cannot be enslaved. But if your father in this equation is black, you will be indentured. And the indenture will last for 21 years if they are married, and 31 years if they are not. So, in 1705, Fortune Game McGee, whose father was a Senegalese man named Sambo. Sambo is a name that comes from the eastern southern edge of Senegal. It means second son. And her mother was Maudlin McGee, who was married already, so this was an affair. She was married to George McGee, and they were from the Belfast area of Ireland, but they were Ulster Scots who were there planting plantations for the English and then decided to leave because of the uprising that was happening in Ireland against them. So because she was Fortune's body, held all of the elements that created those first race laws, she got ensnared. And she was sentenced to indenture until she was 31. And 2 successive generations of hers were also indentured. And I began to ask questions as I was looking at the genealogical listings. You never saw men listed. Why? Like, what's happening? Are they in a brothel? Like, what? Why aren't the men being listed? And it turned out, I decided to get a little curious, and I did a little, Ancestry.com DNA match and looked for the surnames of her indenturing families, which I know. It's the Day family and the Fuchs family. And the Fuchs family goes all the way back to William the Conqueror. I mean, these are gentry class people. They're used to, controlling everything and everyone. And they had been in the court of all the courts, actually, King Henry V, King Henry VIII, all of them. And they're in my blood. Their surnames are in me. So it looks like what they were doing is that the men of these indenturing families were raping their mixed race and even white indentured servants in order to bilk the law, to exploit the law, and breed labor for another 21 years, another 31 years. I want to tell you about Leah Ballard. Leah Ballard is my 3 times great-grandmother. And Leah lived in South Carolina. She was the last enslaved woman in our family. And she had, according to our family story, 17 children. But after the Civil War, she appears for the first time on a census after the Civil War, and there's only 12 children listed. And those 12 children, they're all born after the Civil War. So what we imagine, or at least after it began, is that she probably lost her first 5 children in the midst of slavery. She probably lost them either to death, because in South Carolina, 1 in every 3 enslaved children didn't make it past their 16th year in the area where she was. And if they were in the Low Country, down where they were doing rice and bricks, down by Charleston, then they didn't make it past their first year. 1 in 3 didn't make it past their first year. Or they could have been gifted to a family member along with the beds and the dressers. Or they could have been sold downriver. In other words, into deeper Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, which is likely because we have DNA matches down in that area from that strain. She knew a lot of loss. I want to read to you a portion of the chapter about her. The chapter goes into the life of enslaved people and what we can understand from the context about Leah's possible life. But I want to read to you about the moment that she realized that she was free. Leah Ballard Ankrum Williams was a woman for whom the putrid taste of antebellum loss had become familiar. That loss followed Leah throughout the first 19 years, and its ghost haunted her in every generation till the day she died. The same year that Leah gave birth to Martha is my second great-grandmother, our nation pushed the 13th Amendment from passage to ratification within 12 months. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. These words catalyzed the reversal of the original Virginia laws established in 1662, as well as every race law that bound Fortune and her descendants. The laws that bound Henry, my second great-grandfather, and his brothers, and the South Carolina laws that shackled generations of Leah's family and would have bound them forever. I can only imagine Leah's tears and dancing on the day that she learned that she was free. To think of that joy now, my body cannot contain it. Leah would taste loss again, but for this moment, I imagine Leah standing still on the land she and her people had slaved for generations. On the day she hears that she is free, Leah raises her face to the noonday sun. She looks up to the trees, the leaves blowing and swaying overhead. Leah remembers the sound of the spirit songs in the brush arbor. She remembers her mother's voice in the trees. She listens close, and soon she hears the harmonies of her foremothers, all the way back to the Yoruba and Hausa women. They sing to her from the trees. Put on your crown, child. Put on your crown. I came this night for to sing and pray, oh yes, to drive old Satan far away, oh yes, that heavenly home is bright and fair, oh yes, but very few can enter there, oh yes, oh wait till I put on my crown, wait till I put on my crown, wait till I put on my crown, oh yes, Oh yes, if you want to catch that heavenly breeze, oh yes, go down in the valley on your knees, oh yes, go bow your knees upon the ground, oh yes, and ask your Lord to turn you around, oh yes, oh wait till I put on my robe, wait till I put on my robe, wait till I put on my robe, oh yes, Reynaldo y Anita are my great-grandfather on my father's side. They lived around the turn of the century. They were turn of the century people, and they eventually made their way through the Caribbean to Puerto Rico, and then from Puerto Rico into the Bronx and Brooklyn. I like to joke that they were the first Puerto Ricans in the Bronx. They were all established by the 1930s, which is about 20 years before the Great Migration from Puerto Rico. It was very, very soon they began to migrate, right after the annexation. When I did my research on slavery in the Caribbean, I was blown away, first of all, by how connected it is to slavery here. Some of the same owners of slave ships actually worked South Carolina port and throughout the Lesser Antilles. Enslaved people who were brought to the island of St. Kitts, which is where the Weekses were in the last stretch before abolition in the Caribbean. It was understood that 1 in 3 did not make it past 1 year. 1 year, not 1 year old, when they were brought as adults to St. Kitts. They only lived about a year. But they were able to replenish because it was so close to Africa, so they just worked them to death and replenished and replenished and replenished. I want to read to you a quite long stretch, actually, if you don't mind, from Reynaldo and Anita's story, because I think it's so helpful for us to understand how this worked and also the resistance, how people of African descent survived it. In the midst of Puerto Rico's annexed and crumbling economy, Reynaldo Weeks found work in the capital, San Juan. In 1923, he was a black servant, likely working in the household of a white land baron or politician, situated solidly at the bottom of Puerto Rico's racialized hierarchy in an era permeated by eugenics theory, at a time when Jim Crow America won the Spanish-American War and consequently claimed Puerto Rico as its own. In this era, Reynaldo married Anita de Richardson, a black maid from Anguilla. On April 5th, 1923, they lived in Santolce, near San Juan, with their 9-year-old son, Austin, my grandfather. Austin communed around a bomba drum with his Santolce neighbors, all of them annexed Americans without the full rights of citizenship. He watched adults dance out the oppression heaped upon their black backs by San Juan's white ruling class. He bore witness as his neighbors offered their bodies to the bomba beat for cleansing, for healing. Santolce is one of 3 major hubs of black culture and community life on the northeastern coast of Puerto Rico, along with Carolina y Loiza. Much like South Philadelphia was the first northern destination for freed men and women in the post-Civil War era, Santolce became a primary destination for emancipated people throughout the Caribbean. When Reynaldo y Anita returned home from serving their white masters each day, they likely returned to a wooden home built on stilts atop Santolce's swampland. According to their marriage certificate, Reynaldo y Anita lived in Calle Loiza Street, a main boulevard that flooded every time it rained and washed out when hurricanes passed over. I imagine my little grandfather sitting cross-legged on the floor at Reynaldo's feet, huddled in a room with fellow Caribbean migrant neighbors. The rhythm of Santos's Bambasica, walking is what it means, filling the air like a black man's strut. The rhythm has a groove, a swagger, and elegance. It reminds me of my grandfather. Black Puerto Ricans under Jim Crow rule could not determine where they would live, where they would work, or how much their labor would be worth. They could not protect their bodies from exploitation or molestation. They were subject to the racialized boundaries placed on housing, vocation, and rights. But in the bomba circle, the beat beckoned their bodies to move at will, where they willed and how they willed. In the bomba, the men could plant their feet where they wanted for as long as they wanted. The women could shake their hips how they wanted. The dancers could freeze when they wanted. And the women would extend their arms like eagle's wings, gripping their handmade crinolines, and they could move each side as if telling the story of their soul's triumph that day with each beat. Chests faced sky as shoulders bounced and arms pounded air, compelled by the drum. The bomba is pure power and dignity exercised by people stripped of both. They pounded out their pain in the midst of the community, encircled and supported by all. Sharon Lawrence is my mother. Sharon grew up in South Philadelphia, actually one block from where I live right now, in Point Breeze. She sat one day, she told me this story in some of the interviews that I did with her. She sat one day in the principal's office, not because she was in trouble, but because she was one of the smartest children in her class. She was literally one of 3 honor students in her class. And as you would think honor students would get to do, she didn't get to learn. It was her job to mule messages throughout the school for the teacher. So on this day, the teacher had a message for the principal and gave my mom the message to mule to the principal. So now she's sitting in the principal's office waiting for the principal's response. And she looks next to her, and there's a box of books. And that box of books is full of tattered books that only have don't have covers, many of them. Some of them have ripped pages, literally ripped out of the books, writing in them. And there's still a label in the book that says where these books came from. They came from the Drexel School, which was just 2 streets away, 2 blocks away. Sharon's mother, my grandmother Willa, tried to get Sharon into the Drexel School, but she was told that she was out of district, so she couldn't go. Meanwhile, Sharon's next-door neighbor, a white boy, went to the Drexel School. So Sharon is now sitting next to this box, and it occurs to her on this day, this is the day that she learned in school, that she is less than. She is not worth preparing to lead. She is not worth preparing to flourish. Sharon grew up and joined SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was among the charter members of the office here in Philadelphia. So the portion I want to read to you from here is actually about that time in her life. One day in 1965, shortly after Selma's Bloody Sunday, Sharon and her best friend Linda rode the bus north on 16th Street en route to Philadelphia Community College, where they planned to complete 2 years before transferring to Temple University. But Sharon saw 2 young men mounting a sign that read SNCC Philadelphia, SNCC, stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, at the entrance of 521 South 16th Street. Sharon and Linda got off at the next stop and ran back to the sign. SNCC was opening its first northern office in Philadelphia, and they sought organizers and staff. Fresh out of high school, my mother became the church outreach organizer for SNCC's Philadelphia office. She was trained by Diane Nash, James Farmer, and Stokely Carmichael, among others, and befriended SNCC members like Ruby Sales, who attended SNCC's very first annual summer training in Atlanta in 1966. On June 5th, 1966, James Meredith, whose body had absorbed the trauma of the University of Mississippi riot when he integrated its campus 4 years before, set out on a one-man march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. Meredith wanted to encourage Black Mississippians to register to vote. He was shot down on day 2. Veteran Mississippi SNCC organizer Charles McLaurin recruited and partnered with Martin Luther King Jr. and SNCC's new chairperson, Stokely Carmichael, to pick up Meredith's march and finish in his name. Midway through that journey, McLaurin scouted a location in Greenwood, Mississippi, where the group could camp out overnight without harassment from local police. Tucked inside a close-knit Black community, Broad Street Park became the staging ground for Carmichael's most consequential speech. Organizers rode a pickup truck to the edge of the park. Carmichael had been picked up by the local police and detained earlier that day. He had just returned to the park when organizers called him to the truck, hoisted him onto its flatbed, and passed him the microphone. He called the crowd to engage, or to courage, rather. Don't let them scare you when you start opening your mouth. Speak the truth. After admonishing the crowd to love their Blackness, to define themselves, to reject the white view of Blackness, and to instead set the standards for all, Carmichael's voice raised with his fist as he zeroed in on the heart of the matter. We got to get us some Black power, he said. We don't control anything but what white people say we can control. We have to be able to smash any political machine in the country that's oppressing us and bring it to its knees. Carmichael's call for Black power was immediately interpreted by many whites as a foreboding threat of violence or a call to become anti-white. It was neither. Carmichael, who later renamed himself Kwame Ture, seemed to cut time in half with his cry for Black power. You see, before that moment, people of African descent had lived under the hegemony of whiteness for 304 years. When the first race laws were passed in Virginia in 1662, that hegemony told us we were not human. We were not beautiful. We were not meant to determine our own movement, our family structures, our language, our religion, or our future. We were not meant to steward land, only to work it for the benefit of whites. We were meant to be ruled. We were created by God to lick white men's boots and like it. We were not even meant to have boots. This was the theological lie. According to Genesis 1:26 and 27, if a person is human, then they are created by God with the call and the capacity to steward the world, to make decisions that impact the world. The core sin of people of European descent has been to claim exclusive right to humanness, and thus the exclusive right to stewardship of the world. Carmichael's call was rebellion against that lie. It was a clarion call for people of African descent to embrace their Blackness, their humanness, to embrace the truth that white people are not God. They are merely human. They do not get to determine the boundaries of beauty. They do not get to determine the boundaries of black flourishing. They do not get to shape our own views of ourselves. We determine our worth. We determine the boundaries of our own flourishing. We determine how we will view ourselves. And this self-determination is not limited to the realm of cultural and social discourse. If we are human, then we are created to flourish and exercise agency in the world, economic and political, as well as social and cultural agency. So, friends, how do we repair what race broke in the world? We repair it by doing some truth-telling. Truth as reckoning. You see, truth requires that we wade into that troubled water. It requires that we seek the truth. Seeking the truth requires humility. It requires that we recognize that we don't have all the information that we need. It requires that we embrace the truth. You see, Jesus said, "I am the truth." When we reject truth, or twist truth, or hide truth, we reject, twist, and hide Jesus. We actually push Jesus away. We push the power of the resurrection away. We don't get to experience it because that power is only unleashed when we reckon with truth. So we must listen. We must listen to the stories. We must do some truth listening, and then we must do some truth telling. Telling the stories that we've heard. And then we must do some repair. And we talked about that today, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, except to say that today we talked about the principle that we gained from 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14. And that principle is that repair is fundamentally about relationship. Reparation is fundamentally about repairing the relationship, the relatedness that broke with the sin of domination. And so we have to go back and ask the question, how did it break? And then part of that repair has to be the acknowledgement that when it broke because we failed to bow to the image of God in the other. So repair will require that those who have dominated now turn and walk 180 degrees in the opposite direction and now bow to the stewardship of the moment, to the stewardship of repair by those who have been dominated. Like David did with the Gibeonites, he asked, what do you say we must do for things to be made well with you? In the same way, America, the United States of America, must ask people of African descent, who are the only ones who have never received federal reparations for the oppression we've suffered, what do you say we must do in order for things to be made well with you? And then we must do it. That is the only way across the river. That is the only way to freedom for all of us. And then finally, we must do some forgiving. And we must allow ourselves to be forgiven. In this chapter, I have to admit, I'm going to, confess that I did not start writing this book with this chapter even in the book. The first iteration of my book proposal had the last chapter being on restitution. And so it was going to be truth-telling, reparation, restitution. But I got to thinking, as I was about to write that chapter, I said, this doesn't lead us to the beloved community. Because even after you have restitution, there are some things that can never be restored. Like my second great-grandfather, Hiram Lawrence, or first great-grandfather, Hiram Lawrence, on the Lawrence side of my family, who lived here in Philadelphia. Hiram owned a whole block of homes in the Elmwood section of Philadelphia. A block, like multiple homes. That land was snatched from him by eminent domain. He was paid pennies on the dollar for what that land was worth, and as a result was only able to replace a block of homes with one home that he housed 3 generations of his family in. That block of homes was legacy. That block of homes could have funded the college educations of all of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Wealth was snatched wrongfully, and communities were busted up. I want to read to you a little bit about the community that I live in right now. The area, I live 1 block from where Hiram's widow moved to after he died the year that his land was claimed by eminent domain. We believe he died of a broken heart. And Ella Fortune, his wife, direct descendant of Fortune Game McGee, moved into a house on Braxton Street, right next to, 1 block away from where my grandmother and grandfather lived. As we close, it's important to recognize 2 hefty questions that need to be considered when oppressed people decide to forgive in today's America. How do we forgive when the oppressor continues to oppress? And how do we deal with the shame and stigma of oppression on our souls? I grew up visiting my grandparents, Junius and Willa, in their South Philadelphia neighborhood, Point Breeze. My mother and father, Sharon and Dennis, would pile me and my 2 sisters, Holly and Mary, in the back of the Buick and drive us from the suburban neighborhood of West Oak Lane to visit Grandmom and Grandpop. South Philly had its own particular vibe. Streets built for horses and buggies were so narrow that 1970s Buicks and Cadillacs lined the sidewalks, literally on the sidewalks. On the opposite side of my grandmother's street, South Chadwick Street, across the street from Child's Elementary School. This street, once lined with trees, a thick canopy of protection from extreme heat and heavy rain, filtering every breath over South Philly's African-American community. When my mother was a little girl, trees lined Child's School and every city block. Nestled in the comfort and chaos of 3 generations sharing a 3-story house on Dickinson Street, little Sharon used to go outside when the moon rose over Mount Point Breeze, and she would say good night to the tree across the street. She would talk to the tree. She had a relationship with that tree. Then one day she woke up and the tree was gone. Slowly, all the trees disappeared from Point Breeze. When Child's School was left barren, even Child's School was left barren. Black residents were never told why the trees were taken from them. They were not consulted or given the chance to petition for the trees to stay. White city leaders exercised dominion over black residents and took their trees. Meanwhile, trees in the white communities slightly north went untouched. Old-timers whispered that the city didn't want to keep up tree maintenance in the black communities, but a 2019 article on Philadelphia's PBS affiliate revealed that Italian immigrants integrating Black South Philly at the time petitioned the city to remove the trees. They wanted to be able to lean out of their windows and see what was happening, to call out to people on the streets. The city never asked the neighborhood's longtime black residents what they wanted. Rather, they accommodated whiteness. In subsequent years, heat islands sprawled across the southern swath of the city, along with other black and brown neighborhoods throughout Philadelphia, drawn by unshaded black roofs, black top parking lots, and exposed concrete streets. Homes became ovens, and fans and air conditioners ran on overdrive, pushing particulates into unfiltered air. Hundreds of people died who did not have to. My generation of children are the fruit of environmental racism. We played double Dutch jump rope, hopscotch, and jacks on bubbling tar streets and hot concrete, warped and cracked by rainwater that stagnated with no roots to absorb it. We had an increased chance of suffering from asthma, lung disease, heart disease, and cancer, with such few trees to filter toxic air rising from our homes, and the 150-year-old refinery just 1 mile away, producing the bulk of the city's toxic waste. We did not know trees once lived among us. We did not know that we too were worthy of their protection and filtration. We simply played and made do. When the occasional car tried to pass, we would all move to the side and wave them by. The old-timers sat in folding lawn chairs in front of their row houses, and they sat directly on their front steps, talking to one another from stoop to stoop, across and up and down the street. The Point Breeze community was largely African American since the 1930s, when Willa and Junius's generation migrated north to the Great Migration. Most families in the area hailed from the same communities in Virginia and South Carolina. At night, the children sat on the steps and talked outside. I will never forget one night when I sat on the steps of the home next to Grandmom's house, talking with new friends who had just moved in. We marveled at the moon. The full moon seemed to be suspended in the sky with clouds slowly floating across its face. It would hide, then come out again. The older brother, about my age, 9 years old, spoke in a voice that signaled that what he was saying was sacred and secret knowledge. I was to hold and keep this knowledge and never forget it. That is the friendship moon, he said. If you meet under this moon, you will be friends forever. It was a long time before I ever saw that moon again, though I have looked for it. I don't know whatever happened to that little boy, yet in my memory that was the magic of South Philadelphia, a community teeming with life and families and old-timers on front steps. Decades later, I worked as a campus minister specializing in racial reconciliation in Los Angeles, and my cousin, Alan Jenkins, had become the pastor of St. Barnabas Bethsaida United Methodist Church in Philadelphia and invited me to preach one Sunday. And we hadn't been back to the neighborhood since Grandmom Willa passed a decade before, and St. Barnabas is located just 6 blocks from Grandmom's house. As we drove away, all we saw were gutted row houses, the aftermath of decades of drug epidemics and city neglect. Literally, no windows, boarded up doors, and burned out gutted edifices. Where are all the people, I thought? Where is the community? Well, I'm still learning this story, but this is what I know. On our visits, in the year after Grandpa Junius passed away, sometimes I would watch my mother's brother, Uncle Richie, take furniture out of Grandma Willa's home. This is the 1970s. She would cry, begging him not to take her couch, her watch, her coffee table. I never understood why he did this. I was a little girl, but I understood that he was hurting his mother. Why would he do that? I thought. I loved Uncle Richie. He used to hold me when I was a baby. He was always attentive and always present when we visited. Songwriter and poet Richard Lawrence, my Uncle Richie, became addicted to heroin in the mid-1970s. Willa's furniture fed his habit. What I didn't know then was that heroin had proliferated in the neighborhood. Young men who sang doo-wop on street corners in the 1950s and 60s were now trying to figure out how to survive between heroin hits. You see, in 1994, Nixon's domestic policy advisor and Watergate co-conspirator John Ehrlichman confessed to a reporter that in 1969, when Nixon's presidential campaign vowed to mount the first war against drugs in U.S. history, the goal was not public health. The goal was a racialized political win in the shadow of the civil rights movement. Quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that," said Ehrlichman, "had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." He continued, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Heroin was pumped into Point Breeze through the mafia, police, and small dealers. Heroin addiction took over. Richie thumped to the floor and died in his bedroom in my grandmother's house on South Chadwick Street on March 28, 1975. Crack was pumped into Point Breeze in the late 1980s and 90s, around the time my grandmother Willa was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She did not recognize my mother, and neighbors would find her wandering the neighborhood sometimes, unkempt, wearing her bathrobe. On March 11th, 1992, she was found on the floor in her home. She had been punched to death. By a crack addict who had pillaged her, excuse me, for all she had. As I write this, my body tingles under the weight of this layered trauma. What do we do with that? You see, my grandmother's not coming back. The tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of young men and women and children that we lost from those drug wars in Philadelphia are not coming back. The communities that we lost are not coming back. They're being gentrified right now. I moved in to that neighborhood about a year and a half ago, 1 block from where my grandmother lived and where my mom grew up. Typical now is to see white people walking their dogs with a latte in their hands, and pet grooming, lots of pet grooming places all over the place, and cafes. What do you do with that? We have to forgive. Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, there is no future without forgiveness, because here's the thing, if I were to go to my grave demanding of white people all that they owed me, I would go to my grave in a deficit because they can't give it. You can't bring back communities that were busted up. You can't bring back people who have died. There's a dead body in the room, and it's not going to be resurrected, and we have to face that. So forgiveness is necessary if we are to continue to live together in common space. I have to release you from that which you cannot repay. And you need to allow yourselves to be released. You see, the power of forgiveness is that it's not really for the sake of those who oppressed. It's for the sake of the oppressed. Because oppression creates a tie between oppressor and oppressed. Oppression says to the oppressed, you need the oppressor to live. And even after the oppression ends, if they do not pay that reparations, if they do not do right, then you need them to do right in order for you to be well. But that is to give them too much power. You see, what forgiveness does, according to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, is that it cuts that tie. It says to the oppressor, the one who oppressed, you can go now. I have no need. Go. I release you. Now. And then it turns to God. And it says to God, okay, God, you are the one who has cattle on 1,000 hills. You are the one who changes the course of rivers. You are the one who moves mountains. Ante up. And you know what? God is happy to do so because God can and God cares about the needs of God's children. So, I would rather that people of European descent would choose with their own volition to do right, to repair what race broke in the world. But I do not need for you to choose, because there is also God, actual God, who can change the course of rivers. And it might take 1 or 2 or 3 generations, but that river will change because I, too, am a child of God. I want to read you the last page of the book, and then we'll close. There are 2 paths set before the oppressed. One path leads to rage, compounded pain, sickness, and death. The other leads to the beloved community. On that road, there is truth-seeking, truth-listening, truth-telling. There is reparation and equity, and there is mercy, release. For the sake of my body and soul, and the bodies and souls of my family's descendants, to the 10th generation from me, I choose beloved community. Now, for readers in European bodies, you also have a choice. You can continue the war for supremacy against the image of God on earth. You can resist God's beloved community. Resist truth. Resist equity. Resist justice. Resist mercy. You can try to maintain your space at the top of a crumbling racial hierarchy. You won't be there long. I mean, you already are in the global minority. And within 1 generation, you will be in the minority in the United States as well. And when that day comes, you can wage war. Or you can lean in to truth. Lean into repentance, repair, and allow yourselves to be released, forgiven. Only then can we find a new way of being together in the world. And I can almost hear my 7 times great-grandmother, Fortune Game McGee, who walked this earth 10 generations ago and absorbed the wrath of the very first race, gender, and citizenship laws into her traumatized body. And in my mind's ear, I hear her whisper, "Yes, child. Yes." Amen. Should I say it here? Should I say it here? Yeah? Okay.
Klaus, there we go. We want to be mindful of the time, and I'll share that Lisa is going to spend a little time with the pastors and with the anti-racism task force immediately following this, and so it's important that we have time to be able to do that. So I'm going to open up the opportunity for maybe a question or two. If people have it, or I'll ask a question. You all know that. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. One of the struggles that we have as a congregation when we think about going out into the world is that we're really good, we are excellent check writers, right?
Yeah, okay.
We're very good at that. We are a generous congregation, and we put hope and development and support for organizations doing great things in Philadelphia and around the world, and we put that in action by giving them funding.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes when we use that language of reparations, it's easy, I can imagine us as a congregation saying, okay, this is hard work, but we are good at writing checks, right? I'm going on sabbatical tomorrow, so I can say whatever I want today.
That's hilarious.
So I guess I'm interested to hear if you have a way to describe reparations that isn't just about writing a check.
That's great. Reparations is not just about a check. Actually, reparations is about repair. And so, there have been several different lists of ways that things that need to happen in order for things to be made well in the African American community that have been issued over decades. In the early 1970s, the Black Manifesto actually discerned, a group of Black pastors from around the country came together and they discerned this is what it would take for things to be made well in our community. And it really has to do with a fundamental restructuring. Because you see, you have to deal with the policies that created the structure that gave a need for your check in the first place. Because ultimately, repair, is actually about leveling the playing field. It's really about redeeming America. It's really about reforming the way that we do life together. In every way. So it would be about, let's take a look at our policing system. Let's take a look at the reality that police literally came about as a structure in America, as slave patrols. That was their origin. And if it wasn't slave patrols in the South, then in Boston, it was the patrol against immigrants. But it was really to protect basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants against that encroaching horde, right? And so what does it look like then for us to not have a world that is policing, but rather a world that is committed to public safety? Because right now our structure is not about public safety. It's about policing. It's about containing violence in particular areas and making sure it doesn't come over here. What does it look like then to transform in that way, to transition in that way? What would housing look like if we actually began to ask the question, how did Point Breeze get to be what it is right now? How did this gentrification happen? What were the decisions that were made in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that brought it to the place where it was this gutted out, war-torn area? made reparations for those decisions to the community. What might that look like? It might look like policies that level the playing field for those who are coming in, not saying you can't come in, but saying that there might be a certain percentage of houses, a considerable percentage of houses that are set aside and land that is set aside not only to maintain the community that has been there and protect their claim to their own land, but also public trust, public land, so that we can have we can grow our own gardens. We can have connection to our community and trees again. And actually there is a tree initiative, a major tree initiative, that is relining our block. But you look at our block, we have these dinky little trees. You go up 5 blocks and you have these massive trees. It's because 5 blocks up they didn't tear them down. Right? So what's reparations for that? What's reparations for enslavement? Hello. 246 years of enslavement. And should it be limited only to those people who can trace their... No, it shouldn't be limited, because it's hard to trace intentionally. Y'all didn't give us names on the census so we could trace it until after the Civil War. You hear what I'm saying? So why would you limit it to that? You would limit it to that to limit, the amount that you have to pay, the amount that you have to do. But that's not repentance, is it? It's not. So what would it look like? It might, William Darity, economist, and William Darity and sociologist, they have said that if America actually did abide by the promise of 40 acres and a mule at the close of the Civil War, we would not have to have this conversation about reparations now, because land means everything. Land is the most fundamental way that wealth is born, right? Well, black folks never got the 40 acres and a mule, but at the exact same time, white folks got free land through the Homestead Act. And then in the mid-20th century, they got free education and more free housing through the GI Bill. That's how the white middle class was built. But it was not something that translated over beyond whiteness. You see, so how do we make reparations for that? And reparations would not only give the value of the land at the time that it was stolen, it would actually equate, it would calculate what's the wealth, the total amount of wealth that was lost over the course of all those years. And it would give that. Right? So I honestly think that the reason why African Americans haven't gotten reparations, and we've given $20,000 per family to Japanese families who were interned for a few years, horrible years, but for a few years during the World War II. And we gave reparations to Jewish people who were interned and massacred in the Holocaust. But we have not given reparations to people of African descent because the atrocity was so big. Isn't that something? And we want to hold on to the wealth that we accumulated through it. But there's no way to freedom, my friends, unless we go through the troubled waters. There's no way. We will come back around and have another George Floyd 2020 in a couple of years, 1 or 2 years, every 1 or 2 years, until we solve this, until we do right. So reparations is not charity. It's justice. Reparations is not even development. It's making things as they should be, which is repentance. Mm-hmm. Thank you. You're welcome.
There we go. I'm just going to remind you all that we still have books for sale, I'm confident, out in the atrium for $10 each. And so I encourage you to find Alicia. She's right out there, and she will get one for you. Thank you all. Thank you all so much.